In a world that often overlooks the quiet and the underestimated, a teenage girl named Ara Whitaker stands in the shadows of a towering corporate empire, clutching a tattered notebook filled with her late mother's dreams. With dark curls framing her determined face and a weathered hoodie barely hiding her resolve, Ara carries not just her father's dinner, but a legacy buried by greed and lies. When a cruel challenge from a powerful CEO thrusts her into the spotlight, what unfolds isn't just a fix for a broken engine, it's a reckoning that will shake an industry and awaken a city. If you've ever felt unseen or unheard, Ara's story will pull you in, break your heart, and remind you that truth, no matter how long silenced, always finds a way to rise. The laboratory at Stratton Dynamics gleamed under the harsh fluorescence, a cathedral of glass and steel perched high above Detroit's skyline. It wasn't just a building, it was a monument to ambition, its reflective surfaces catching the city's pulse and holding it hostage. Inside, the air carried the sharp tang of overheated circuits and polished synthetics, a sterile scent that clung to the back of the throat. The top floor lab was a fortress of whispers, where every badge was scanned twice and failure wasn't just a mistake, it was a death sentence for reputations. At the heart of the room sat the Helix 12, a 12-cylinder prototype engine meant to redefine the defense industry. Sleek, silent, unjammable, it was the future of autonomous combat vehicles, or so they claimed. But for 3 days it had mocked them all, sitting lifeless while the company's brightest minds circled it like vultures too timid to land. Marshall Greystone, CEO of Stratton Dynamics, stood like a statue carved from ice. Tall, silver-haired, his navy suit sharper than a blade, he radiated authority that silenced the room. His arms were crossed, his gaze slicing through the engineering team as they stammered through their third excuse in 2 days. "It's not hardware," the lead technician said, voice tight with desperation. "We're seeing a misfire in the load sequence. The capacitor bridges aren't—" "Think," Marshall interrupted, his voice a cold whip. "This team doesn't think. This team knows." Silence swallowed the room. No one dared breathe too loudly. In the shadowed corner, nearly invisible behind a utility cart, Henry Whitaker mopped the floor with the steady rhythm of someone who'd long ago learned to blend into the background. 63, with orthopedic shoes that creaked faintly, he spoke little but heard everything. Tonight his daughter had come to bring him dinner, as she did every Tuesday. Ara Whitaker stood near the exit, a teenage girl with dark curls spilling from under a worn hoodie, her backpack sagging with weight it shouldn't carry. Earbuds dangled in her ears, but no music played. Her eyes, sharp and restless, tracked every movement in the room, the flicker of holographic code streams, the engineer's nervous glances, the Helix 12's stubborn silence. She wasn't supposed to be here, but Henry's late shifts had carved this routine into their lives. Marshall's gaze drifted, landing on Ara like a spotlight pinning a stray actor. He tilted his head toward Henry. "That's your daughter?" Henry's mop paused, just for a heartbeat. "Yes, sir." A faint smirk curled Marshall's lips. "Maybe she'd like a shot at it." My engineer seemed to be out of ideas. Laughter rippled through the room, not loud but jagged, a nervous current that sparked from one technician to the next. Phones slipped into hands, ready to capture the inevitable embarrassment. "He's joking, right?" someone muttered. Ara's head snapped up, her eyes wide but not with fear. "What?" Marshall gestured toward the engine, his tone dripping with mockery. "Go on. If you're so clever back there, fix it. I'll throw in a scholarship if you pull it off." Henry's lips parted, a protest forming, but Ara was already moving. The laughter died, choked off by her steady steps toward the Helix 12. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate, walking as if the engine, titanium and millions in the making, was something she'd known her whole life. She shrugged off her backpack, letting it hit the floor with a soft thud, and pulled out a notebook, its cover patched with duct tape, pages worn from use. She opened it to a marked page, revealing a maze of diagrams, formulas, and notes scrawled in blue ink, schematics that seemed to breathe with purpose. The room went still. Henry gripped his mop, his knuckles pale, watching a moment he'd never dared imagine. The hum of the overhead lights buzzed louder in the silence. Phones were out now, not for jokes, but for proof, as if no one trusted their own eyes. Even the security guard by the door leaned closer. Ara approached the engine, her gaze locked on it like it was a living thing, whispering its secrets. The Helix 12 wasn't just machinery, it was Stratton's crown jewel, its specs so classified that half the room didn't know its full design. But Ara didn't need their manuals. She carried something deeper. Memory, instinct, a legacy she had pieced together from her mother's shadow. "Can I touch it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady, cutting through the tension. Marshall let out a dry chuckle. "Be my guest." He said it like he was humoring a child, but Ara's hands were sure. She set her notebook down, its pages fluttering under the lab's air vents, and rolled up her sleeves. Her fingers brushed the engine's casing, cool and unyielding, yet familiar, like a puzzle she'd solved in dreams. "Where's the pulse?" she murmured to herself, her hand tracing the panel until she found the access seam. With a gentle press, a soft click echoed, and the cover slid open. A panel untouched since the last failed test. Colin, an engineer with a permanent scowl, started to object, but the words caught in his throat. Inside, Ara saw the engine's heart, the primary capacitor array. It was wrong, painfully so. The power relay was tangled in a feedback loop, the boot signal trapped in a recursive crash. Not a hardware defect, not a manufacturing slip, a logic error, a blind spot in the software design. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a microcapacitor, one she'd soldered for a school project no teacher had bothered to grade. "She carries parts," a technician whispered, incredulous. Another leaned over her notebook. "That's schematic. It's like ours, but older, cleaner." Ara tuned them out. She unscrewed the faulty capacitor, her movements precise, and slid her own into place. With an L-pin jumper taped to her notebook's cover, she rerouted 2 wires. Her fingers steady despite the eyes boring into her. She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Try it now." Marshall didn't move, his smirk frozen. Colin stepped forward, skeptical. "Seriously?" Another engineer, peering at Ara's notebook, muttered, "She rewrote the boot logic." Colin hovered over the ignition interface, hesitating. "If this shorts, we'll have a fireball." Ara's voice was soft but certain. "It won't. I ran the simulation." He stared at her, then at the engine, and pressed the button. A beat of silence, then the Helix 12 roared to life. The sound was deep, alive, a pulse that thrummed through the lab like a heartbeat. Diagnostic lights flipped green, one after another. Internal displays cascaded with data. The startup protocol flawless. The room exhaled, stunned, as the engine's power surged, smooth and undeniable. The lab fell silent, save for the steady, flawless hum of the Helix 12 engine. It was a sound that had taunted the team for days, a puzzle no one could crack. Until now. Engineers stood rooted to their spots, their tools idle, their breaths held. The air felt charged, as if the machine itself were watching them. Marshall Greystone, CEO of Stratton Dynamics, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight as a steel trap. His silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, but his eyes were stormy, fixed on the teenage girl who had just turned their world upside down. Ara Whitaker stepped back from the engine, wiping her grease-streaked hands on her sleeve, leaving dark smudges on the worn fabric. She didn't smile or bask in the moment. Instead, her gaze flicked to her father, Henry, who stood motionless by the door. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his wide eyes told a story of their own. A janitor who had swept these floors for decades, now watching his daughter command the room. A young technician, fresh from grad school, fumbled his phone, and it clattered to the floor, the sound slicing through the stillness like a thunderclap. Someone started to clap, then faltered, as if unsure whether celebration was allowed. The room was a frozen tableau, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone. Marshall broke the silence, his voice low and sharp. "Who are you?" Ara met his gaze, unflinching. Her voice was steady, almost soft. "I just like engines." Without another word, she slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked out, leaving the hum of the engine to fill the void. No one moved to stop it. No one dared. Colin, an engineer at the diagnostics panel, stared at the screen, where green success logs cascaded like a waterfall. The Helix 12 had completed a full ignition cycle without a hitch, something a dozen engineers and 2 contractors hadn't managed in 48 hours. Ara had solved it in under 10 minutes. The silence in the lab was deafening, heavy with awe and something else. Disbelief maybe, or unease. She didn't even hesitate, Donna murmured, her voice barely audible. As a senior mechanical lead, she'd seen countless designs fail, but this was something else. She walked in and saw it. Marshall said nothing, his fingers gripping the edge of the observation table until his knuckles turned white. Someone in the room broke the tension with a question. What kind of part was that? That jumper. And the capacitor. Did anyone recognize it? No, Colin said slowly, his eyes still on the panel. But she didn't guess. She knew. Donna drifted toward the table where Ara had left her notebook, its pages open and fluttering slightly in the air-conditioned breeze. The paper was filled with scribbled equations, diagrams labeled in cryptic shorthand, and dates, some stretching back 3 years. Donna's finger hovered over one sketch, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't ours, is it? Colin leaned closer, squinting at the page. His breath caught. Wait, this looks like an early Helix revision, but cleaner, sharper, smarter. That's impossible, another engineer said. That version was classified. Donna's voice grew quieter, as if she were afraid to say it. What if it's not just similar? What if it's the original? The room turned to her, eyes wide. Marshall's silence was heavier now, his unease palpable. She said she liked engines, he muttered, his tone no longer commanding but tinged with something unsteady. Colin picked up the notebook, flipping to a page marked with a paperclip. It showed the Helix engine, not the one they'd built, but a raw, theoretical version. Concept sketches, flow models, handwritten alternatives in blue ink, each note initialed with a simple MW. Who's MW? Someone asked. Donna's face paled. I've seen that handwriting before. She hesitated, then met Marshall's gaze. Ara Whitaker. The name landed like a hammer on steel, reverberating through the lab. The hum of the engine seemed to grow louder, as if it too recognized the weight of those words. That's not possible, Colin stammered. She died years ago. Leonard, an older systems analyst who rarely spoke, stepped forward. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of memory. Ara Whitaker trained half this department in Stratton's early days. She designed the first reactor core prototype, smarter than all of us put together. And then she vanished, Donna added, her voice hollow. They called it a lab accident. All eyes turned to Marshall, who stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the humming engine as if it were a ghost. The notebook trembled slightly in Colin's hands. She's the daughter, Donna said, her voice cutting through the silence. Ara, her last name is Whitaker. A few engineers sank into chairs, unaware they'd even moved. Marshall's voice was barely audible. She shouldn't have been here. They were supposed to move out of state. Supposed to? Donna echoed, her tone sharp with suspicion. I checked, Marshall said flatly. Years ago. Outside, in the faded interior of their old sedan, Henry and Ara sat in silence. The car's engine purred beneath them, the only one Ara hadn't rebuilt. The weight of what had just happened hung between them, unspoken. Finally, Henry spoke, his voice rough. You used her notes. Ara stared at her backpack, her fingers tracing its worn straps. I finished them. He nodded, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. You shouldn't have had to. I didn't do it for them, Ara said, her voice firm but quiet. I did it because no one else would. Henry's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. They'll come looking. I know, Ara replied, not with fear, but with a calm certainty that made Henry's chest ache. I should have told you more, he said, his voice breaking. About her, about what happened. You told me what mattered, Ara said, that she was brilliant, that they feared her, that they buried her name. Henry exhaled, a shaky breath that carried years of grief. She would have been proud. Ara didn't reply. She just stared out the window as Stratton Tower faded into the distance, its glass walls glinting in the fading light. Back in the lab, Donna stood by those same glass walls, whispering the name again. Ara Whitaker. By morning, Ara's notebook had spread through Stratton Dynamics like wildfire. Engineers, assistants, and department heads passed it around, some denying what they saw, others lingering too long on the initials, the dates, the symbols that shouldn't have been in a teenage girl's handwriting. M.W. Marin Whitaker. 15 years ago, she'd been Stratton's brightest star, a systems engineer whose legend still lingered. They spoke of how she rewired a prototype cooling array in under 6 minutes with nothing but hairpins and copper wire. How she predicted a capacitor failure 6 weeks out with no data. Just instinct. But then she was gone. A lab accident, they'd said. Confidential. No one asked questions, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't dare. She'd been working on experimental fuel compression when the explosion happened, leaving behind only a scorched schematic binder and a twisted steel clipboard, or so the story went. Now her daughter had walked into their lab with her mother's notes, and the engine they thought was theirs had been brought to life by a legacy they tried to erase. The next afternoon, Stratton's boardroom was packed. Marshall stood at the head of the table, the notebook now sealed in a plastic sleeve, as if it were a dangerous artifact. His hands rested on either side of it, wary as if it might spring to life. Ara and Henry sat near the back, silent, their faces unreadable. Donna sat beside them, her badge conspicuously absent from her lanyard. Leonard stood to the side, clutching a file he hadn't opened in 15 years. Marshall no longer looked like a man in control. His eyes betrayed a man bracing for the fallout, calculating the cost of secrets long buried. Ara Whitaker stood at the edge of the conference room, her steady gaze locked on Marshall Greystone, the silver-haired CEO of Stratton Dynamics. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of her mother's legacy in her hands. She clutched a worn notebook, its pages filled with Marin Whitaker's meticulous designs, the kind of genius that had once lit up this very company before it was snuffed out. "What exactly are you claiming?" Marshall's voice cut through the room, sharp and dismissive, his eyes narrowing at the teenage girl before him. Ara's expression didn't waver. She stood calm, her voice steady as she replied, "I'm not claiming anything. I've shown you proof." She gestured to the notebook, its edges frayed but its contents undeniable. Marshall scoffed, waving a hand at the pages. "Proof? That's nothing but a child's daydreams. Scribbles. You expect me to believe a janitor's daughter reverse-engineered a $40 million prototype just because her mother used to work here?" Ara's eyes didn't flinch. "No," she said, her voice cool and deliberate. "I want you to admit that prototype was never yours to begin with." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Every pair of eyes, engineers, analysts, department heads, shifted between Ara and Marshall. Leonard, an older systems analyst with deep lines etched into his face, stepped forward, his voice quiet but heavy with memory. "I was there when Marin's access was revoked. I saw her designs rerouted through internal servers, buried in code. I watched her warn them about the capacitor cycling flaws, and they ignored her. Completely." Marshall's face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Leonard continued, his words slow and deliberate. "She tried to go public with what she knew. A week later, she was gone. They called it an accident, but I never saw the investigation file. No photos, no logs, just a cleanup order." Henry Whitaker, Ara's father, rose from his seat. At 63, the janitor's shoulders were stooped from years of labor, but his voice carried a quiet strength. "I cleaned that lab," he said. "They ordered me to destroy every scrap of paper with her handwriting. They dismantled her prototype, burned her journals, but they missed one." His eyes met Ara's, a flicker of pride breaking through his weary expression. "She took what was left and finished it." Donna, a senior mechanical lead with years of loyalty to the company, spoke softly but with conviction. "And she improved it." Marshall's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. "You're trying to rewrite history," he snapped. "What's driving this? Nostalgia? Guilt?" Ara's voice cut through his words like a blade. "No, we're correcting it." She stepped to the head of the table, her movements deliberate, and pulled a flash drive from her backpack. "I have every schematic my mother ever wrote," she said. "Every version, every revision, Every prototype up to the Helix 10 model, complete with timestamps, notes, and her initials. You didn't just steal her work. You buried her with it. Marshall let out a sharp, bitter laugh. You think this makes you someone important? Ara's gaze swept the room, taking in her father's quiet strength, Donna's resolve, Leonard's haunted expression. She met Marshall's eyes. I don't need to be important, she said, but I won't let you erase her. The silence that followed was suffocating, a moment suspended in time. Marshall's voice broke it, cold and final. You don't have the right. Henry's response was soft but unshakable. No, he said, but justice does. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, steady and purposeful. The door swung open and four men in dark suits entered, their faces unreadable. Marshall Greystone, the lead agent said, we need to speak with you. Marshall's expression didn't change at first, but his eyes darted to the notebook, then to the flash drive, and finally to Ara. You planned this, he said, his voice low with accusation. Ara didn't blink. No, she replied. You did. The door closed behind the agents with a sound like a gavel striking wood. No one in the room moved. Marshall stood at the head of the table, his fists clenched, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Across from him, Ara remained still, her flash drive and notebook now the center of the room's attention. The engine logs were loaded, the schematics exposed for all to see. Donna rose from her seat, her movements slow but resolute. She unhooked her employee badge and let it fall to the table with a soft clink. I was here when Marin first pitched the dynamic fuel flow model, she said, her voice steady. You laughed at her. We all did. But she was right, and I stayed silent for too long, not anymore. Marshall's eyes narrowed. You're resigning over old papers and rumors? He asked, his tone dripping with disdain. No, Donna replied. I'm resigning because I watched you bury a woman's work, and today her daughter brought it back to life. Another engineer, Cullen, stood next, his hands trembling but his voice firm. I remember Marin's calculations on compressed torque. I still use them in my work. His badge hit the table with another clink. One by one, others followed. Senior staff, junior analysts, interns who had only heard whispers of Marin's story. They stood, their badges piling up, a quiet rebellion against years of silence. Her name was like a ghost, Leonard said, rising slowly. But we knew. We all knew. Marshall's gaze swept the room, his empire unraveling before him. You think this makes you heroes? He hissed. This changes nothing. You don't understand what this company is built on. Henry's voice was calm but piercing. We know exactly what it's built on, he said, and now the world will too. Ara tapped the table's screen, and a video flickered to life, its audio crisp and undeniable. Marshall's voice filled the room, recorded from earlier that day. Go on. If you're so smart, fix it. I'll give you a scholarship. The laughter, the challenge, the moment Ara fixed the Helix engine, and then the confrontation. Marshall's dismissal, his denial, his damning words, you don't have the right. The room watched in silence, the weight of truth settling over them like a storm cloud. The video ended, and Marshall's face was pale, his confidence drained. You're going to destroy this company, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Ara replied. You already did. A single clap broke the silence, not loud, not celebratory, but heavy with acknowledgement. Another followed, then another, a slow ripple of recognition that something monumental was shifting. Donna stepped forward again. We've already sent this to the press, the board, and the Department of Scientific Ethics, she said. They'll be here by morning. Leonard's voice was quiet but firm. You're finished, and she's just getting started. Marshall's shoulders slumped, the fight gone from him. Why now? He asked, his voice raw. Why bring this up after all these years? Ara's eyes locked onto his, her mother's notebook still in her hands. Because you mocked me, just like you mocked her. Because silence didn't save her. It buried her. And I won't let that happen again. She picked up the notebook, its weight a promise kept. Marshall stepped back, his gaze flickering around the room, but no one met his eyes. The space was no longer his. Outside, the hallway buzzed with employees, some watching the live stream, others following internal leaks. Downstairs, security struggled to hold back the press. In the media room, Dana, a junior analyst, uploaded the flash drive's contents to a whistleblower portal. A former project lead sent internal design timelines to investigative reporters. In the break room, someone updated the company's internal wiki. Helix Engine Development. Credits: Marin Whitaker, deceased. Ara Whitaker, restored by sunrise. Stratton Dynamics was trending across every state, not for a new patent or a stock market debut, but for a scandal buried for 15 years. The video of Ara fixing the Helix engine had exploded online, starting on a niche tech forum before spreading like wildfire. By morning, it had surpassed 6 million views. Ara's calm face, her grease-stained sleeves, and the moment the engine roared to life had become a symbol of truth unearthed. The story of Ara Whitaker and her family's legacy reverberated across the globe, looping through coffee shops, living rooms, classrooms, and newsrooms. It wasn't just her breakthrough that captivated the world. It was the raw, unyielding truth she laid bare. Her words, sharp and deliberate, cut through the noise. You didn't just take her work, you erased her with it. That moment, captured on video, rippled everywhere, a seismic shift in a world that had long ignored Marin Whitaker's brilliance. In Washington, D.C., a hushed briefing room held government officials transfixed. Senators leaned closer to the screen, aides murmured in low tones, and a figure from the Department of Scientific Ethics rose. His voice steady but firm. We're launching a full investigation immediately. In Detroit, the glass and steel headquarters of Stratton Dynamics buzzed with something sharper than unease: dread. By 10 a.m., half the employees had walked out, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous lobby. By midday, security guards stopped checking IDs and instead held doors open for a flood of reporters. Up on the top floor, Marshall Greystone, the silver-haired CEO, whose authority had once seemed unshakable, barricaded himself in his office. 2 lawyers flanked him, 3 phones buzzed incessantly, but no call could undo the storm brewing outside. He ignored the hashtags lighting up social media. #Justice for Marine, #Whitaker Engine, or #Truth Never Dies. He ignored the board's urgent demands and the press swarming the building's entrance. He even ignored the emergency shareholder vote set for the next morning. But at 1:32 p.m., when a black SUV with federal plates rolled up to the gates, silent and certain, there was no ignoring what came next. Inside Stratton Dynamics, employees watched from cubicles, huddled around screens, or stood frozen in corners where silence had once been the rule. Federal agents moved with quiet precision, entering the building without a word and heading straight for the elevator. 20 minutes later, the doors slid open and Marshall Greystone emerged, wrists bound in handcuffs. He didn't speak, didn't meet anyone's eyes, just walked through the parted crowd to the waiting vehicle. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the onlookers reacted in fragments. Some clapped, others wept, but most stood still, witnessing the collapse of a carefully constructed lie. In a forgotten conference room on the second floor, Ara and her father, Henry, sat together, untouched by the chaos. They didn't watch the news or celebrate. They just sat, the weight of the moment settling around them. "I never thought we'd see this," Henry murmured, his voice soft but heavy with years of quiet endurance. Ara's eyes stayed fixed on the table. "I didn't either," she said. "I just wanted to make you dinner. I didn't know it would come to this." Her words trailed off, and Henry turned to her, his gaze steady. "You did exactly what she would have done. Only she'd say you did it better." A slow, aching smile crossed his face. "And she'd have said the same about you." At 3:17 p.m., a message flickered across the company's internal network, brief but seismic. Effective immediately, Marshall Greystone has been placed on indefinite leave pending federal investigation. Below it, another note followed. The Stratton executive team acknowledges the contributions of Marin and Ara Whitaker to the Helix development program. A formal statement and reattribution process will follow. No author was named, but it didn't matter. The truth was out, undeniable. Across Detroit, a digital billboard glowed to life, not with an ad for a product or an engine, but with 2 faces side by side. Marin Whitaker, the brilliant systems engineer whose work was stolen, and Ara Whitaker, the teenage girl who brought it back to light. Beneath them, two words burned bright: truth rises. A week later, Marshal Greystone's office stood sealed, its nameplate gone, the marble desk cleared, and the blinds drawn tight. No one spoke his name above a whisper, and Stratton Dynamics, for the first time in decades, felt like it had ground to a halt. But beyond those glass walls, a movement was gathering speed. Ara Whitaker stood on the steps of the State Science Commission building in Washington, D.C., wearing a borrowed blazer and jeans still faintly scented with engine oil. Cameras surrounded her, their lenses catching every angle, but her voice never wavered. Behind her stood Henry, quiet as always, and beside him, Olivia Whitaker, Ara's grandmother, who had arrived unannounced. Her silver hair was pinned back, her green coat immaculate, a matriarch stepping into the light after 15 years of absence. Ara hadn't even been sure she was alive until Olivia stepped out of a black town car, her presence undeniable. "I kept everything," Olivia had whispered as they embraced, her voice steady but warm. "Your mother's notes, her letters, her photos, her journals. I knew this day would come." Now the three of them stood together, three generations bound by a legacy that refused to stay buried. Inside the building, Calvin Rohr, head of the Department of Scientific Ethics, approached Ara with a simple blue folder. She opened it carefully, revealing a signed letter from 5 U.S. senators, a grant document, and a project proposal. At the top, bold letters declared the Whitaker Initiative, a national program dedicated to protecting, funding, and uplifting young inventors from underrepresented communities. A center for ethical innovation, a research facility built in Marin Whitaker's name. One condition stood out: Ara would chair the advisory board. She blinked, overwhelmed. "This is real," she managed, her voice catching. Calvin nodded. "Your mother's work deserved a future. Now it has one." Ara didn't cry, not yet, but her fingers trembled as she handed the letter to Henry. He read it twice, his eyes tracing every word, before passing it to Olivia. Silent tears fell as she closed her eyes, whispering Marin's name, a memory that had never faded. That evening, the trio returned to a modest community center in Detroit, one Marin had helped build years ago. The city had offered a grand auditorium, but Ara declined. She didn't care for spotlights, she'd said. She preferred rooms where people truly listened. Children filled the front row, young girls clutching notebooks, boys holding toy engines and clipboards. They might not have grasped the full weight of the week's events, but they felt the electricity in the air. Ara stood before them, holding her mother's violin, rediscovered in a closet, wrapped in an old blanket, untouched for 15 years. Its strings had been restrung, the bow rehaired, but the wood still carried the echo of Marin's touch. As the lights dimmed, the room fell silent. Ara lifted the violin, and the first note was faint, like a whisper in a winter storm. Then it grew, smooth, strong, resonant. Each note wove a story: Marin's unfinished designs, Henry's quiet devotion, Ara's rising courage. When the final chord rang out, no one clapped. They sat, transformed, in a silence that held everything. As the room emptied, a small girl approached Ara, her worn notebook pressed tightly to her chest. The air in Detroit was crisp, heavy with the scent of steel and steam rising from the city's grates, curling into the night like whispers of a world in motion. Beyond the research center, the skyline glowed, its lights pulsing faintly, as if the city itself were breathing, stirring from a long, uneasy sleep. A distant train groaned, its low rumble weaving through the streets, steady and relentless, like the heartbeat of progress. Inside the Whitaker Center for Ethical Innovation, the world was quieter, softer, but no less alive. The hallways, bathed in a gentle golden glow, stretched silently, their exhibits locked away for the night. Yet in the central atrium, a single light burned bright, casting its warmth over a glass case that held the weight of the legacy. Inside the case rested two objects, each carrying a story of its own. To the left, a worn notebook, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges, held together by fraying duct tape. The blue ink scrawled across its pages was still legible despite the smudges, a testament to the hands that had pored over it years ago. Marin Whitaker's hands, brilliant and unyielding. To the right gleamed a brass violin, meticulously restored, its polished surface catching the light like a promise kept. Below them, a steel plaque bore an inscription, its words carved with quiet defiance. To those who were silenced and those who choose to speak, truth does not fade. It waits. Ara Whitaker stood before the display, her reflection faintly mirrored in the glass, her features aligning with the ghost of her mother's image etched in memory. She was still, her breath shallow, her dark eyes tracing the lines of the notebook, the curve of the violin. In that moment, she was both daughter and heir, carrying the weight of Marin's brilliance and the fire of her own resolve. The silence around her felt sacred, heavy with the unspoken, grief, pride, and the ache of a truth finally uncovered. She didn't need to speak. The moment spoke for itself. Slowly she turned, her footsteps echoing softly down the hallway toward the exit, her shadow trailing behind her like a thread of memory weaving through time. Outside, the wind carried a faint melody, delicate and unplaceable, as if the city itself were humming a song of return. No one could pinpoint its source, but it felt like something coming home, like a note held too long finally released. Earlier that evening, a young girl had approached Ara, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Lena," she'd said, her small hands twisting nervously at her sides. "I want to build engines, too." Ara had knelt to meet her gaze, her smile soft but fierce, like a spark catching flame. "Then you already are," she'd replied, her voice steady with conviction. She took Lena's hand, guiding her gently to the center table where Marin's blueprints now lay enshrined behind glass, no longer hidden, no longer buried by the greed of Stratton Dynamics. "Start here," Ara told her tone both an invitation and a challenge. "But don't stop here." Lena's eyes widened, bright with awe and possibility, nodding as if she'd just been handed the key to her own future. Behind them, Henry Whitaker stood quietly, his weathered hands clutching a handkerchief. He pressed it to his face, wiping away the dampness that had gathered in his eyes. At 63, the janitor of Stratton Dynamics had spent years sweeping floors and watching from the shadows, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been stolen from his late wife, Marin. Now, seeing Ara stand where Marin's legacy shone brightest, his chest ached with a bittersweet pride. Olivia Whitaker, Ara's grandmother, stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Her touch was steady, grounding, a silent reminder of the notes she'd safeguarded for years. Marin's notes, her truth, now given back to the world through Ara's courage. The room was small, but its light felt boundless, radiating not from the screens or billboards that dotted Detroit's skyline, but from something deeper, something truer. It was in Lena's trembling ambition, in the blueprints that had been buried and then unearthed, in the violin that had once played Marin's heart and now stood as a symbol of her voice reclaimed. The night was still, but it hummed with possibility, as if the world outside were waking to the promise of what could be. Ara's journey to this moment had been one of defiance and discovery. She'd pieced together her mother's work, navigating the skepticism of engineers like Colin, who'd been stunned into silence by her success, and the quiet support of Leonard, the older systems analyst who'd known Marin's brilliance and the company's betrayal. Donna, the senior mechanical lead, had begun to question Stratton Dynamics' actions, her doubts growing as Ara's truth came to light. Even Marshall Greystone, the silver-haired CEO with his sharp demeanor, had been forced to reckon with the legacy he'd tried to suppress. And Calvin Rohr, head of the Department of Scientific Ethics, had seen in Ara not just a girl with a knack for engines, but a leader, offering her a role to shape the future. But for Ara, it wasn't about titles or triumphs. It was about standing in front of that glass case, seeing her mother's reflection beside her own, and knowing the truth had finally found its voice. As she stepped out into the Detroit night, the wind carrying that faint, haunting melody, she felt the weight of her mother's legacy not as a burden, but as a light to guide her forward.